Hey guys, MetalJesus here, and I am back again with Kelsey. How's it going?
Good, thanks for having me. So today we are going to be talking about the RetroN 5, and I know people have seen a lot of reviews about the RetroN 5. It's been out for a while, and that's exactly why we are reviewing it again. So this is the perspective about a year and a half after buying this. Where is it at? Was it worth it? Is it still holding up a year and a half later?
Yeah, I get this question a lot, and I know you do as well. So we're going to address that in this video. Let's take a look. Alright guys, so this is the RetroN 5 here, and we kind of want to walk through kind of what it is first. I want to acknowledge right off the bat, this is a dusty machine that I use a lot. So I know some of you are looking at this going, why doesn't he clean it? Well, because I use it.
Yeah, I have the same problem.
It's not a really good excuse, but but it is used, and you can tell based on this. So you're going to test me to see if I remember all of the systems.
Yes, can you name every system that this system plays?
I will try. So, Genesis, Mega Drive.
There you go.
Super Nintendo, Super Famicom, NES, Famicom, so that has its own slot right there.
Different pin sizes.
That's right. Then it also plays Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance.
There you go.
And with the optional adapter that just came out within the last year or so, this plays 3 different formats. So it's Game Gear, which is awesome. Then it also plays the Master System cartridge and card. How'd I do?
Good. Yeah. Sounded good. So, as you can see, this is a console that plays a lot of consoles. This eliminates your need to have a ton of consoles sitting around on your shelf if you need to kind of get rid of some stuff and have less space. This is a great option for that. The nice thing about this, one of its big selling points, aside from just being all of those consoles in one, is that it's HDMI.
Yeah.
It is really difficult to hook up old systems to new TVs and have it not look like crap.
Yeah.
There are plenty of people who are purists and are going to say just get a FrameMeister. Those are hundreds of dollars.
And they're not being made anymore as of the recording of this. So they're going up in price.
So there are options totally if you're a purist for getting an HD signal from your old consoles. But if you don't want to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars, but you do want your consoles and your games to look nice on a newer TV, this being HDMI is really, really cool. The other cool thing about it is that you can change the filter settings on it.
Yeah.
So you can add things like scan lines. Now, it's not quite the same as playing it on an old CRT. It is artificially adding the scan lines in there. But there's a bunch of other filters.
Oh yeah, there's an ability to smooth out some of those really rough pixels. Now, normally you wouldn't do that. However, I do that all the time on the Game Gear, because the Game Gear is a very small screen on that portable device, and when you blow it up into an HD television, the pixels look pretty bad.
Yeah.
So this device here, it's optional, you can turn it on, and suddenly those games do look a lot better. So it's nice that there is that ability.
Yeah.
The other thing we should probably mention though, this is emulation.
Yes.
So it is not 100% recreating the actual hardware like some of the other devices like the Analog Mini NT or whatever it is, you know.
And that's part of why this is not nearly as expensive.
Correct.
So this is emulating what you have. You have to put in the cartridge yourself.
Yep.
It takes the ROM from there, and then that is what you're playing. It seems to do it pretty well. I am not an incredibly picky person, and I know some people are. That's totally fine. But this is emulation. Now, the nice thing about emulation, though, is this has an SD card slot on the back.
Right.
So you can do things like save states, which is vital for hard NES and Famicom games.
Yeah, I mean, you no longer care if, well, one, it's nice for RPGs, maybe the battery's dead, or you just want to walk away for a day or two, right? But also action games. You can save, for a big boss battle. It's awesome.
And if you're playing it, you mentioned a lot of the Japanese consoles like Super Famicom and Famicom. Obviously, you can't really play an RPG that is in Japanese unless you read and speak Japanese. Except with this SD card slot, you can load translation patches onto them. So you can pay 10 or 15 bucks for a copy of Chrono Trigger on the Super Famicom instead of the expensive Super Nintendo version. And still be, playing it from a cartridge. Again, it's emulation, so it's not quite the same, but if you like having a more authentic feeling but still being able to play it, that's an option for you as well.
Actually, a lot of people consider this to be its huge selling point, is that you get to play the physical cartridge, and then you have all these little extra bonuses, you know.
Yeah.
It's very cool.
Totally.
And actually, I mean, that's the reason why I originally got this, is because for the longest time, for the first 150, 200 videos, I was capturing the old composite, the little yellow, and then upscaling it for my videos to HD. This just became the all-in-one solution for me. It was just like overnight, it's like all my games could just output to HD. I could capture them with the Elgato, and it just transformed them.
Yep, this is a great option if you're capturing gameplay for any reason. The last thing I want to say, I think the last thing, you might come up with other things, is that it has these controller slots here on the side for NES, Super Nintendo, and Genesis. You can use these controllers with any game. You can use a Genesis controller to play an NES game. You can use an NES game to play a Game Boy game. You can even use an NES controller to play a Genesis game, although you won't have enough buttons, so don't do that. But you can. It'll let you do all of that.
Yeah, that's the other thing I really like about this, is that you can make the argument, and we've kind of talked about this. It's like, well, what is different about, say, the RetroN 5 to, like, say, a Raspberry Pi? Is that, for me personally, it is, again, it's like my physical game collection can be plugged into this, and I really like that original controller. That game is designed to be used with that, the layout of the buttons, the way the shoulders, all that stuff work. It feels very similar to playing it on the real system.
And it's legal.
And it's 100% legal. So, I mean, that's a big distinction here. You know, maybe not everyone cares about that, but it's not storing your ROMs. It literally, every time you plug in a cartridge, it is ripping that ROM and playing it at that moment.
Right. So you brought up the controllers.
Yes.
So we should mention the controller that comes with it.
Yeah, and so actually, I do want to, this video is going to be about, the overview and our thoughts, stuff like that. There are some aspects of this that are not great either.
Oh, of course. It's a whole review.
But this controller, when I see that controller, I'm like, this is where it starts to kind of go downhill a little bit.
So should we start with some of our critiques of this system then?
Since you're holding the controller.
All right. So this is probably my biggest problem with the system, and thankfully it's easily fixed by just using a different controller.
Right.
This is a bad controller.
Yep.
And yours did not last a year and a half.
No.
It just stopped working.
I mean, literally, there's nothing I can do to make this work. And by the way, I'm not really hard on controllers. I mean, I didn't throw it, break it, whatever. Literally, from one day, it just wouldn't turn on. I plug it in because it's wireless, so it has a little, lithium-ion battery in there. Nothing. It just does not work. Yep. I don't know why.
And mine is spotty. Mine will sometimes desync and not work too. So, that's just the controller working at all. I don't really like, it doesn't have a D-pad. It's got this weird clicky thing instead.
Almost like a Neo Geo Pocket Color.
Yeah, which is cool, but
it's
not terrible.
But it's not a D-pad.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not what you want for a lot of those old games.
Right.
So I don't really like this controller.
No, I don't either.
And I almost wish they would make a version of this console that just didn't include a controller, and they could make it cheaper that way.
Right, because this is not a cheap controller to buy by itself.
I mean, they made it wireless and everything, and it's got a decent amount of tech in there, so I feel like they could drop the price of the system if they just bundled it without a controller, or even if they gave you some like wired but third-party NES or Super Nintendo controllers with it.
I agree. The other thing that I run into with this a little bit, and it has to do with my collection specifically, is that, I'm really big into homebrew games, and often they just don't work. At least that's been my experience. If someone builds a game from scratch, it's probably not going to work. I mean, I might get lucky, but in general, no. And I feel like that's becoming more of the scene a little bit, where people are getting into, making their own Famicom games or whatever. I typically they just won't work on here. Yeah,
I have a couple like ROM hack, Pokemon bootleg games type things that work fine in this, but it might be the difference between it being a ROM hack of an existing game versus an entirely new homebrew type thing. So I don't really know what the criteria is for whether or not this thing will read it, but sometimes it doesn't. And so that can be a bummer if that's a thing that you're interested in collecting and playing.
I would also say, and I ran into this recently this week, as I was going through and playing a bunch of Game Boy Advance games. Now, these are licensed, released retail games. And specifically, like, a quarter of them just wouldn't even. Well, some of them would boot, but they wouldn't run.
And these are the 3D ones, right?
These are the 3D ones. So, for instance, I'm showing one right here. So this is a game called Kill Switch. Came out on the PlayStation 2, but there's also a Game Boy Advance version. This one will boot up, but then when you get into the game, the graphics are just really weird. Like it's bizarre looking. There's a handful of them that just go to a black screen and sit there forever.
That's so weird, because I actually don't think I've ever run into an official released game that doesn't work on this.
Yeah.
They advertise this as running 100% of all retail released games. I was pretty sure that just couldn't happen, but there's proof that at least a few of them don't work.
Yeah, and I've cleaned it and all that sort of stuff. And it happened to, like, say, about 6 of my games. But you're right, though. It's a subset of maybe the more popular titles. And that's, to that point, most people who buy this that are looking for the games that you grew up with as a kid, the Marios, all that stuff, they all work.
Of course.
Of course.
Yeah.
And so for the average person, it's not that big of a deal. But for me, it's kind of a bummer because, again, I use this for YouTube, and I couldn't use it for these couple games. So it's just something I want to throw out there. The other thing, too, also, I want to mention, a lot of people ask me about this, is the quality of sort of putting cartridges in and pulling out. Now, you sell these, right?
Yeah, we do.
And so do you run into, is that an issue with you? Because it's never been a problem with me, but I think they might have maybe did a revision or something. I don't know.
Yeah, so I'll be totally honest. The one that I got was when they first released them, the very first batch they put out. And I use mine a lot, putting, testing games and pulling them in and out. That one, I did start having issues with the pins. Some of the pins would bend in there. You can bend them back, but of course, that's not a problem you want to have when you're buying something.
Well, I think most people are kind of concerned. It's like, well, what if I've got a rare NES game or Super NES game? Should I put it in there if I'm worried about pulling that out, having to wrench it to get it out? It's
weird. I have never run into that issue where you feel like you're hurting it bringing it out. These definitely are tight pins.
Yeah.
If you put something into an NES nowadays, unless it's been given a new pin set, it's going to feel super loose. And, these are going to feel like polar opposites.
They are.
These are definitely tight. I think the NES one is pretty tight. I think the Game Boy slot I've never had an issue with the Game Boy slot.
Which is, that's really weird. So, again, some of they just have different feels, and so the Game Boy Advance, no, that pops it out like normal.
And again, it might just have to do with different times they came out of the factory or however it worked there. But it's something to be aware of, but I don't think it's that big of a problem.
Yeah, I've never heard of anybody sort of permanently damaging a cartridge. Although, to be fair, when Nintendo made these, they were designed to be pulled in and out of the real the consoles hundreds and hundreds of times, so they're usually pretty robust.
Yeah, you gotta be careful with it, but it shouldn't give you that many issues. Are there any other glaring issues you got with this?
The only thing I would say is that I am really happy with this device. Even, some of the things I've kind of complained about, whether it's the controller or maybe a game or two not working on it. My biggest complaint, I think, is that it's just a little bit on the cheap side as far as the manufacturer. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about here.
Which is weird, because people think this is a really expensive system. It's around $150 to $170, depending on where you're getting it from. And that's not expensive when you break it down into how many freaking consoles you're getting, especially Famicom games.
Yeah.
It's not easy to get Famicom games running on, you have to import a Famicom normally, or you have to get some other clone system, right? That's pretty much your only options. So that part, to me, and of course having the Game Boy games on the big screen, because the Game Boy player is really expensive.
Yes, and the Game Boy player doesn't output to HD like this does.
Right, exactly.
So again, that's a great deal.
So I think all of those things make it worth the price. I agree with you. If they could make it a little bit more expensive and up the quality a little bit more, or even just get rid of the controller so it's a little bit cheaper and you expect a little bit of the not super amazing quality.
Well, because for instance, we were talking about pulling the cartridges out. You have to kind of move them back and forth a little bit. The console's so light and cheap feeling, you kind of have to hold it there. You know, it would be nice if there was a little bit of heft to it, a little bit of weight, just in its design to kind of just feel a little bit, you know, better built.
It's interesting just because if you have heard of like the Analog MT, which is an almost $500 system, and that just plays NES and Famicom.
Yeah.
So how expensive would this need to be really, really good, you know?
Yeah, and honestly, like, you know, to your point about the different systems that it plays, you know, that's such a good value. Like, especially if they were able to build this in as well.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you know, $250, I think that's very reasonable. And the other thing, too, since this has come out, the price of games and the price of collecting games has risen as well. So I think people are a little bit more used to things costing a little bit more too. I'm not saying that that's a good reason for it, but again, if they raise, you know, spend a little bit more money on the research and development and the manufacturing so that you can fix some of these little last minute things too, and then charge us more. I think we're okay with that.
Yeah.
You know,
I would say overall, I am happy with the RetroN 5. I definitely think there are some things that could be improved with it, and I hate the controller, and I wish that I hadn't spent money towards this on that controller, because it's just money that I mean, I straight up do not use the controller.
I can't.
So,
but I don't need to, you know, and so, yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
You plug in a Genesis controller or a Super Nintendo controller, you're fine. And I'm with you. I think it's an amazing value. I use it for any video that we do on my channel that has these systems in there. This is where I usually go first because it's just so convenient. It's hooked up to my TV. It's hooked up to my Elgato. I can switch back and forth really quickly. It's awesome, you know? So.
And the one final thing I want to say is I know, especially with the first run of these, there were a lot of people who got some that were just kind of defective. The company that makes these, Hyperkin, has a pretty good return policy. They're usually pretty understanding if you have something wrong with it. If, you know, within the first year of using it, you have your controller stop working or something like that. I personally have seen people been able to get just entirely new systems. So while it is not perfect and there are sometimes defects, they are a little bit of a pain in the ass maybe to get around, but you can get a replacement.
Yeah, and that's true with almost any other tech as well. So as long as they support it really well, that's all you can really ask for, huh? All right, where can people find you on the internet?
You can find me on Twitter @KelsLewin or my YouTube channel, youtube.com/KelseyLewin. I also have a podcast @GameBlitzShow.
Very cool. All right, guys, thanks for watching. So what'd you guys think of this video, doing a review of a product after I've been using it for quite a while? And the reason why I think this was such an interesting topic to take on is because, you know, initially you have that honeymoon of when you get something new and, you know, you haven't put it through its paces yet. You haven't beat it up a little bit. You haven't used all of its features. And so that's why I was really interested in kind of going back to the RetroN 5, giving you my honest opinion about what makes it great and also what isn't so great. It was definitely a cool opportunity, and I'm glad that Kelsey was able to join me on it. If you guys haven't subscribed to my channel, please do. I release 2 new videos every single week. Thanks for watching.